Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we are looking at another Chinese vehicle, and this vehicle is the Type 58. Now it may seem strikingly, well, the same as another vehicle that we already have in game, and that is the T-3485. And that's because, well, this is basically a Chinese upgrade of the T-3485. But the history around it seems to be at least misted by all of the different accounts of this vehicle, what actually was the upgrades and what were the plans for it as well. So in this video we're going to go through the general history that we know, we're going to go through some of the different interpretations of history that we also have, and what are the differences between the Type 58 and the T-3485 that we actually know of, and some which may be different. You can see I'm going to have to use a lot of weasel words here, because to be quite honest, the history on this machine is not exactly known because of certain things I'll go through. So the first thing to understand is the USSR, or the Soviet Union, decided to supply the PRC with a ton of T-3485s between the years of 1950 and 1955. With this, the People Liberations Army, or the PLA, this became its most numerous tank. Because at the time they didn't really have a lot of other stuff. They had a few other machines. I believe they even had a T-26 and a bunch of Japanese vehicles, such as a Soki, or at least a few Sokis. But the main tank that they had was the T-3485, and the idea was, at some point down the line, they would have their own built tank, and this would be eventually the tank that we saw in the last video, the Type 59. But there were supposedly plans to actually make a homegrown T-3485, which would have eventually been called the Type 58. And this is where the story gets a little bit confusing. So we know for a fact that the Chinese were given plans for a T-54 MBT, the T-54A. They were given a bunch of Soviet engineers, they set up factories to build them, and we know for a fact that's where the Type 59 comes from. When we look at the Type 58, it's a little bit more, well, not really making a lot of sense. Because this thing was the most most used at the time by the PLA forces, the People Liberations Army, it's kind of startling that there isn't as much information, or at least not enough corroborating evidence or information about this thing to really have an accurate picture of how it ended up as the Type 58. So let's go through it. So the first things first, in October 1949, after Mao and his people were able to have a successful revolution, create the People's Republic of China, on that they had a victory parade, and this victory parade had obviously a bunch of tanks such as the Type 95 Soki, Type 94 TK, Hargos, Chihars, and all of these. They even had captured a bunch of vehicles such as the M3A3, M5A1 Stuart tanks, the LVTA-4, which are some vehicles we'll be having a look at, and they also had some rarer vehicles. They even had themselves an M4A2 Sherman and a T-26 from 1937. But as you can tell from these vehicles, by 1949, some of these are more than 10 years old, and it's not exactly something that, if you are a nation which wants to push through, which wants to be able to become a world power, or at least put yourself on the map, it's not really what you are looking for. You know, it's not something that you would want. So instead, at the time, the PLA decided that they needed some new tanks. The PRC, under the communist regime of Mao, also agreed. So therefore, they decided to go to the Soviets for help. Now, the Soviets gave them T-3485s. They also gave them T-54As, and then from there, what is history? So, with this said, they got a bunch of T-3485s, and what is interesting is, in the Korean War, they only use T-3485s. A lot of people get a bit confused. So with the Type 58, because of its upgrade package, it was actually done after the Korean War was finished. So all of the tanks that you see the Chinese using in the Korean War are straight up T-3485s. They are not what you would class as Type 58s. So with that said, that's pretty much the history behind that. So if you see any pictures which are looking, at the Korean War, and you're seeing T-3485s, they are T-3485s. So now we get into the weird and not maybe true history of the Type 58 and how it came about. So in 1954, the PRC asked the USSR permission to produce a indigenous T-3485, and they wanted to do this by 1958, hence the name Type 58. Now, this would kind of make sense, because, as we know, they did the same thing for the T-54, but the question is, why would you do it for a T-3485 if you already have agreed that a T-54 could be the one sent over and produced? Why would you want to create yourself a homegrown T-3485 when you can get yourself a T-54A instead? Well, that is the question that a lot of people have thrown at this story and said it doesn't really make sense because of this fact. And I think that's fair enough, But the idea was they began to organize licensed production of the T-3485 in the same year with the designation Type 58. But the production was supposedly slow or never even started. So the simple fact at the time was the PRC was unprepared for any form of large-scale industry. I mean, it makes sense, right? In the years following the communist victory in 1950 or 1949, the industry across the country was never ready for serious tank production beyond a few workshop conversions. This can pretty much be seen because they didn't have any massive tank production beforehand, so where would it, magically come out of thin air? Instead, what they had to do was build it from the ground up. So despite the poor state of the Chinese industry at the time in tank making, some workshops had managed to produce a set of tracks in 1955, and by May of 1956 a gearbox was also successfully made, and then in February 1957 a prototype V2 34 diesel engine was made, which meant that the PRC was ready to organize production lines for the T-3485 and was due to begin manufacture in the tank in 1958. But after the trials for manufacturing the T-34 parts had gone on for so long, they'd already negotiated the production of the T-54 as an indigenous species of tank. So therefore, why would you once again create the T-34? So therefore, everything was dropped, and they decided to go and make the Type 59. Now, that is one story that could have happened with the T-3485. They set up all of these factories, but it took them too long, and then a better idea came along, so instead they went for that. The problem with this story is that with whole factories creating just gearbox, just tracks, just prototype engines, it makes a lot more sense that they're just building replacement parts. One thing that you would see from if they were trying to create a prototype T-34 would be a case, would be, the armor, would be the turret, would be some kind of factory working on the gun. But instead, we have factories working on minor parts, which are parts which break quite a lot on T-3485s. So a much more likely story is that the PRC were just building replacement parts for their existing T-3485s. So instead of creating an indigenous Type 58, they were instead just making sure that their stuff kept running, which I think personally makes sense. Now, there are 4 key reasons to doubt the PRC ever producing or attempting to produce a T-3485 as well. As I said, they definitely produced parts for it, but trying to produce a whole tank, that is a different story. So the 4 things against this are that most sources, both Western and Chinese, they suggest that an agreement with the USSR was made as early as 1956 to produce the T-54 in the PRC. The first batch of these Type 59s were delivered in 1958 using the Soviet-supplied kits and were accepted into service in 1959, hence the designation Type 59. So this, it makes no sense for any work on a full-scale T-34-85 production to take place in the PRC as late as 1957. Whether the PRC intended to produce the T-34-85 back in 1954 remains unclear. So once again, the argument, why would you create this when you could have something much, much better? Now, the only reason to create the first thing would be for cost reasons. And it seems like if they were trying to create a modernized version of their army, that consideration would kind of go out the window, especially in a communist state. The next point is that the story itself, it has way too many variations and inconsistencies between sources to be true. So the most telling one is the T-34-85 prototype was nearly produced and then produced and partially trialed, or whether a short production run of T-34-85s were made. So nobody knows whether these were made. Some are claiming that they did, in fact, create a full T-34-85. Others claiming that they only made parts, which were used later for replacements. Others saying that these were even tested. But the thing is, we will never know. Everybody seems to contradict each other. The next one is one which holds a lot of credibility, and this is Yuri Pashalok. Now, if you don't know who Yuri Pashalok is, he is a famous Soviet tank historian. He is one of the large guys, if you want to have a look. He has many books to read from, or at least about him, and well, I suppose if you can read Russian, they're not too bad. Hopefully you can find so much translated to English. But basically, Yuri went out and he reported that the Type 58s and T-34-85s that he studied when he was in the PRC, so the People's Republic of China, they all had Soviet serial numbers on them. So to him, they were all from they were first Soviet built, sent over, and they still had Soviet serial numbers. So if he studied ones which didn't have Soviet serial numbers, either on the engine or in another part of the vehicle, that could be an indicator that they weren't made by the Soviets. But the issue is, all of the ones he saw were. The stories of Chinese T-34-85 production also proliferated because of World of Tanks, which is very, very odd. For some reason, I don't know why, but when the Chinese tech tree was added, there was this big push in World of Tanks, of all things, which basically ran the story that these were homegrown T-34-85s. And I don't know why, but if you go back to forum posts, if you go back to some articles, you can see it for yourself. Even on the main page, I believe, of the Type 59 on World of Tanks, you can see that it has this story, which is very interesting. So what is the difference between the Type 58 and the T-34-85? We've talked all about in this video how they're pretty much the same thing. Well, the Type 58 is technically an upgrade package to the T-34-85. The question is, what is upgraded? And to be honest, once again, hard to tell. There are some things which we can definitely say are true, such as the fact that it has some more mounts on the top, and these are pretty much what we have from photographic evidence, what the Type 58 package consisted of. So the first one is a hard point for stowing a 12.7mm machine gun, which you see on top of the one in War Thunder Before Your Eyes. It was always on the right cheek side of the turret, and it appears to be a copy of the stowage mount as seen on the rear of the T-54 and Type 59 turrets. So this could definitely be plausible, a place to put the 12.7. There's also a distinctive second cupola in place of the original Lotus hatch. The original hatch was removed and a simple steel cylinder fitted over the hatch hole. Some of these cupolas had crudely made vision slits, apparently without optics or even simple glass, although others did not feature vision slits. So that was that was that. And then on top of the crude hatch door, there was a mount for another 12.7mm machine gun. Now remember, this isn't all of them. So you have two mounts on the top of it, two cupolas, which had mounts for 12.7mm machine guns, which is kind of funny. And then also there is a new rear transmission, rear hull plate hinge. And this was an exterior rod type and essentially strengthened the joints when opening the rear of the tank for inspection. Chinese SU-100s and also T-34 based AVREs also given this upgrade. There are a few other things that may have been added to this, and these are the ones which are for debate. So all of the photographs that we've seen, we can see exterior photos, we can see what's going on. But there are a few upgrades which may be inside, which we don't fully know about, but could be in. And one of them is a new engine, a new diesel-built engine with a bit more oomph, with a bit more power, which I think would be a hell of a lot of fun. At least it would give the the Type 58 a distinct difference in slight playstyle from the T-34-85. Another thing to it is one of the big reasons why we struggle with the Type 58 when it comes to actually working out what the upgrades were. A lot of the models which are restored in either Chinese museums or across the world, they're all different, because what has happened is people have got them and they've all taken their own interpretation of what the upgrade was. So if you see a Type 58 today in a museum, it might be completely wrong compared to what it was back in the day, and this makes it even more confusing when it comes to it. So overall, you can see the Type 58's history is a little bit all over the place. But the main thing is, when it comes to game, it's a T-34-85. 5.3 would work great. I don't think the addition of the 12.7mm would make its change in BR. It should have exactly the same shells as the T-34-85, maybe give it a little bit extra horsepower, but overall it would be exactly the same playstyle. Everything would be, from a game point of view, very, very similar. The only thing I could see would be a slight difference would be the fact that you'd be better at killing aircraft. But it's just an interesting tank with an interesting story, because there's so much unknown about it, and it would be great just to kind of understand why. Like, why is it this tank which has the least information on it? But I think it should be added, just because it is a distinct tank for the Chinese, even if you don't believe so, since it was technically Soviet-made, it was used by the Chinese, and it was upgraded by the Chinese too. Overall, I'd love to see it in game. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.